have a friend group that meets for dinner every week. John is very charismatic and usually directs the conversations. We used to have conversations about different topics. Even though everyone wasn't interested in all the topics, we were happy being friends and having dinner together. Then, Richard became invested in having dinner conversations that he found interesting. One week, Richard apparently agreed to pay for John's meal as long as John brought up a certain topic. That deal worked for one dinner. At the end of the meal, we noticed Richard picking up John's tab. One of us asked about it and John explained. We quickly decided that that agreement between Richard and John was unconstitutional. John accepting payment for a meal in exchange for doing a favor for Richard was fundamentally corrupt, quid pro quo or this for that bribery. We agreed that buying someone a drink was reasonable, but something as significant as a meal was not, because it might influence the direction of our conversation. So then, Richard started sponsoring articles in the local newspaper and running ads on local radio stations about the topics he wanted to talk about at our dinners. For a few weeks, enough of us had seen the same ads or news stories that they would come up naturally in our conversations. Eventually, we noticed that the informational ads oddly reminded us of our friend Richard's interests. We decided that he was free to pay for ads as long as he wrote a note at the bottom of each ad or news story acknowledging that he'd sponsored the message. When Richard really wanted a topic mention, he sponsored ads and news stories that made John seem really knowledgeable. Then, John had more authority and incentive to guide the conversation towards that topic. Eventually, our friend Charlotte brought up how targeted Richard's ads were becoming. Richard's meddling gives John an advantage over any of our other friends who could direct the conversations. Richard is setting our agendas, and he knows it. We decided targeted advertising was okay, unlike the meal ordeal, since John had no influence over what the messaging was, and John did not directly financially benefit. As long as there was no risk of the advertiser, such as Richard, coordinating with who they were supporting, John, any of the friends could spend as much as they wanted on ads to influence our group's conversations. Charlotte muttered, "Entitled jerk. Soon enough, we'll only talk about what you pay to advertise." Other friends in the group started running their own ads for what they wanted us to talk about at the dinners. Suddenly, some friends were spending way more on influencing what we were talking about than they would ever reasonably spend on eating dinner. Some of us started promoting Blake as our most influential member. We ran ads about topics that made him seem more knowledgeable than John. We suggested that he talk about different topics during the dinners than the topics John or Richard would want to talk about. Charlotte commented, "Weren't things better when we just had a natural flow of conversation and got to talk about whatever happened to come up?" Her comment was met with strained silence. A local ad agency, Pac-Man Ads, saw some of the many advertisements. Pac-Man himself approached our friend group and offered to support the group by printing pamphlets to inform us about current events at no cost. Pac-Man's only ask was that he could record our conversations at each meal so he would have feedback about how the conversations were going. We were desperate, so we accepted Pac-Man's independent help. When Richard noticed that there was a limit to how many pamphlets could be printed each week, he started giving money to the ad agency in exchange for them printing his preferred pamphlets. We noticed Richard's preferences were the most common items found in the pamphlets, but decided Richard paying Pac-Man was not quid pro quo corruption because no specific member of our group benefited from it and might feel indebted to Richard. Some of the friends approached different ad agencies in town to print pamphlets about what they wanted discussed. Soon enough, we would arrive to our dinners and be met with a stack of pamphlets at each seat. In light of fairness, all the participating ad agencies got access to the conversation recordings from our friend group. The dinner conversations were becoming louder and more combative. There was much less variation in what was being discussed. It was just the topics proposed by John or Blake. To compete with Richard, a few of the friends who agreed on a topic pooled their conversation starter funds to run primetime ads for their friends to see and pay for premium service from an ad agency. When the advertising rates for all of us increased, the subgroup confessed to forming this alliance and paying for ads. Their defense was that any of them individually could not afford to out-advertise Richard. We decided that since the subgroup was composed of individual friends, their subgroup had a freedom of speech and could independently fund, conversation starters together. Charlotte was outraged. Some fix. We should have agreed not to advertise to influence our conversations in the first place. We never talk about things I care about anymore. But I have a family to support. I would have to shell out half my paycheck to get you all talking about anything relevant to my life, even if I found a subgroup I agreed with. Again, her remarks were met with an uncomfortable silence. Towards the end of the meal, someone said, I think we should agree that the ad agencies are independent, so we should not limit how much any of us is allowed to support them. Even if the ad agencies happen to play favorites in this group, we should assume in good faith that they are just trying to promote the best conversation we could be having. Richard chimed in, I agree. It is not our place to interfere with each other's freedom of speech if any of us chooses to support any of the ad agencies that promote certain topics. Now, many of my friends who can afford to are paying Pac-Man ads and other ad agencies crazy amounts of money to support the topics they want discussed in our friend group. Blake and John and any of our other friends who want to be influential have to beg the ad agencies for their support. Now the worst part is, I suspect Richard approached John and offered to pay Pac-Man ads to continue supporting John in exchange for John doing Richard a favor. This would be quid pro quo corruption, using Pac-Man ads as an intermediary. The legal loophole of limitless donations to political action committees breaks down the separation between contributions and expenditures established in Buckley v. Vallejo, 1976. And bet your last political campaign expenditure that this quid pro quo corruption is happening in the USA today.